So now, I'm going to hand over to Andy Rogers. Andy's done some wonderful work looking at adverse lives and developing a trauma-focused therapy. Okay.
Just hope everything's set up. Thanks, Hugh. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit more broadly, I guess, about and hopefully lead into Ariane and Jill's examples of working with complexity, both in community and secure sort of setting. So I'm sort of taking a sort of more strategic view and trying to explain some of our collective thinking over the last 15, 20 years of working across criminal justice, but also social care, education, but always with complexity. And I've titled this Trauma Organised to Trauma Informed. So much to say, so little time to say it. So please, you guys, organise me so as I don't go on too long. I just want to talk about some observations, really. And these are not mine. These are over lots of red wine conversations and other things. But who are we talking about when we work with young people in the criminal justice system? And from my experience, invariably, we're talking about complex needs. And by that, I mean young people present with multiple needs often, high-risk behaviours and complex management difficulties. So this group of high-risk, high-harm, high vulnerability. And certainly that's the group we see knocking on the door of mental health organisations, certainly inpatient provisions and things but also social care, on the edges of care, and into the secure estate. So that's the group really that we're focusing on when we're talking about complexity. What do we know about this group generally? That they present with common histories of complex experiences of trauma that isn't PTSD. It's a really unhelpful way of understanding trauma and complexity. So complex trauma, attachment disruption, relational disruption, parental substance misuse, mental health difficulties. These are just examples. Head injury that Hugh's spoken about, communication problems, challenges in education, and I could go on. We see some of these difficulties often very early, but they re-emerge often around year 9, intensify, they become higher risk, and become less tolerated as young people grow into adolescence. Again, some observations. Young people at this complex end of where we work challenge whole systems, in my experience. Social care, education, CAMS, criminal justice. And those systems, none of those systems has the answer on their own. The majority of the young people don't present with a mental illness or are explained with a single label or a single diagnosis. So I started this in a bit of I've done this a lot now, as a bit of a joke. But conduct disorder, ADHD, PTSD, ASD, LD, attachment disorder, bipolar, or borderline personality, or whatever, and psychosis. But literally, on the other end of that, you see reports. You can have 3 different reports about the same kid with all those labels. Not only that, they also have violent offender, vulnerable, dangerous, self-harmer, arsonist, internalizing behavior, externalizing behavior. And we drive our interventions often based on those labels. What we also see, I hope you're with me on this, by the way. I hope I'm not on my own. Is young people getting passed between and within systems. And I've been lucky or unlucky, having managed inpatient provision, worked in the secure estate, working with lots of looked after foster adoptive parents, social care systems. I see the same young people, depressingly, moved in between and within systems, which at a fundamental relational level is reinforcing of some of their problems. So we pose the question, same client group, but different treatment systems. And often where they end up is arbitrary, depending who they may see in the criminal justice system, which psychiatrist or psychologist they may see, what the report says, which label they get. So different systems governed by different principles, funded differently and with different aims, are all trying to support young people in a coordinated manner. And sometimes that looks a bit messy. And if in my experience, you talk to young people and their families, it certainly feels quite messy. Again, some observations from myself and colleagues is that a categorically driven approach There is no single theory, answer, reason why young people present with this level of complexity. So categorically driven systems are simply too simplistic. They don't give us the answer. And not only that, they're not neutral in their intervention. We provide interventions, whatever they may, they're prescribed, and they're often prescribed just like we'd prescribe a medication for a diagnosis. So even psychological interventions, anger management because they're angry. And they're single modality driven. What I mean by that is they come from one single theoretical perspective, cognitive, behavioral, whatever it may be, biological, offense-focused, delinquency theory, criminology. Interventions are often therefore piecemeal and delivered to the individual. We place the problem in the child rather than actually focusing most, or if not all, of our resources on the systems in which they're in. And having worked across those systems, while hopefully we would all say we want to be child-focused, often we apply our understanding of adults to children. And if there's nothing else you take away from today, adolescents are not mini adults. Hugh's very clearly defined that for us. And by adolescents, I mean well up into our 20s. We can't take the literature around CBT that we work with adults or adults with sex offender, adults who display sexually harmful behaviour and apply it to children. It just doesn't work. We just haven't got the evidence to say the same. We have to think developmentally. My own view is we have to think developmentally with adults as well, but hey-ho. So what are the consequences? Often the underlying, the hidden needs, the needs behind the behaviour are not met. We see lots of silo working. We've got a team for everything, substance misuse, all these different things, head injury, all these different separate elements, all trying to work together, picking up on Geeta's things. We see intra and inter-system conflict. Yeah? We see territory. We see inconsistency in care, different ideas being thrown, different interventions in different pieces, lack of coordination, again, which Geeta talked about, and it's reinforcing. And ultimately, this is not neutral. This is not a neutral intervention. It's an inconsistent intervention, which is reinforcing often of some of the problems. Are you with me? Seeing some nods. Okay. What I'm going to try and do is try and explain a little bit, and this is pretty, I think, new stuff, and I'm certainly learning to understand this way, but to understand the impact of trauma and complexity on systems. And I work across a range of systems now, sport and business and all this thing, and this has relevance anywhere where there's complexity and high threat, in my experience. Human beings don't work well under high threats. The more anxious we get, the more stupid we get. Hugh will hopefully expand on that if you're interested. Yeah, we are less able to make good decisions the more anxious we are, the more threatened we are. Yeah, and things happen in our brains that mean that. So we've coined this term normalizing the dysfunction. Our work is messy. It's messy because it's at the edges of what we know. Anybody that says they know the answer to working with the complexity is lying. Yeah. But what we can do is we all have knowledge that we can bring together, and if we truly pull that together, then that's the best chance that we've got. So I'm going to have a go at trying to explain some of this through understanding trauma. What do we know about some of the responses? And this isn't me. This isn't my stuff. This is robbed from Sandra Bloom, who developed some stuff in America. But we've adapted it and moved on it a little bit. So what do we know the impacts of people who experience trauma? And by that I mean not just big T traumas, not just single incidents, but the drip effect of adversity. Lack of basic safety and trust. Loss of emotional management, difficulties with emotional regulation, which also impact on brain development. We know that. Problems with cognition, thinking, problem solving. Problems with taking other people's perspective, mentalizing, knowing where I am and where I am in a system and my emotions and where I am, but also being able to understand your perspective too. Risk decisions. Communication starts to break down. Yeah? We don't pick up the phone. Problems with authority. A confused sense of what's right and wrong and justice. We begin to not quite see around the edges. It becomes grey. and difficulties to see the future and to let go of the past. Pretty negative. Those tend to be the impacts, the broad impacts of trauma on individuals and families. But here's the crunch. When we work with people who've experienced adversity and trauma and complex trauma and complexity, it's traumatic. It's challenging. And over time, if we work in those systems, and I've seen it, we can start to take on some of those characteristics too. We call it parallel process. And organizations, like individuals, are living complex things, teams and organizations. And they're vulnerable to stress. They're vulnerable to, stress and trauma. And they can be traumatized too. Our organizations that we work in can be traumatized. Our political systems can be traumatized by what we're faced with, threatened. And so what we see over time, if we don't pay attention and we don't embrace is probably the wrong word, but we don't recognize the impact of how working in these high-pressured, high-threat environments over time impact on all of us, we start to see the same things play out in staff. And we see this across social care systems, across criminal justice systems, lack of trust. We start to get a bit paranoid. 5 minutes. Okay, we're doing all right. We start to see people struggle with emotions and high levels of stress and distress. We start to see poor decision-making and risk-making, and difficulties in taking perspective and seeing perspective. Communication breaks down. We've all been there where I don't want to make that phone call to that other group of staff over there in that other team. Or I'm sat in a multidisciplinary meeting with all the right words, Geeta, about integrating, and I know we've got to work multidisciplinary, but actually we don't get on very well, fundamentally, because there's lots of not said things. We have to talk about these things. Problems with authority, the bosses are always wrong, the system's always wrong, it's them. Blame gets shifted around. Confused, we start to see, and we see in certain aspects of our work, actually boundaries start to be stretched and moved, and what's right and wrong becomes a little bit more blurred. And it was always better back then, and it's all going to be terrible in the future. No. Not only that, if we're managing staff and working with staff who are experiencing and working under threat, then actually we start to see that play up through organizations, into boardrooms and into political systems and strategic. Any nods around? Are you still with me? Or have I gone too far? So what we see is systems becoming, unless they're aware of these processes, unless they truly invest in their staff and their cultures, however good they set out to be at the beginning, over time, this is a pervasive, it's toxic over time. We've got to keep renewing, it's dynamic. We can't set up a system and then expect it over, because it's good at the beginning, it will be good towards the end. It's constant threat that we're under because we're being bombarded day in, day out by the threats that are brought to us. Okay, take a breath. How long have I got? 3 minutes? 1 minute. Whoa. So one of the things, going back to the categories, we've got to change the fundamental question. It's not what's wrong with them. It's not the individual problem or us. It's what's happened to them and us. And I've never worked with a young person, a family, a member of staff, where actually, when you understand the story, the journey that they've been on, their behavior makes perfect sense. Even the ones that are screaming at each other in a multidisciplinary meeting. When you understand their perspective, the label tells me nothing. That they're angry tells me nothing. It doesn't tell me that I need anger management. I want to understand why, and once you understand the story. So we want to be asking what's happened, and that helps us understand and think about how we intervene. In terms of intervention, I'm going to be really quick, and our guys are going to try and talk to you about ways in which we've implemented this. Truly collaborative whole system approaches across an establishment and a team. That means talking about the things we don't say, interdisciplinary conflict, our different perspectives, calling it out. It also means very strong and aligned leadership. If your parents of your CAMS and your education and your yacht team don't get on, then your staff are all going to play out like adolescents. If they don't align around a vision, that's what collaboration truly means. We can say the words, and we've got to embrace the conflict and the trauma. It's not about individuals. People are trying their best most of the time. It's actually that we're all under high levels of anxiety and threat when we work with high levels of anxiety and threat. And in those circumstances, humans actually don't function particularly well. And embedded services, working alongside each other rather than words like in reach, which means we know you don't. Expert, these sorts of things. Call these things out. And in the secure estate, we've got a workshop later on with a little bit more time to talk about this, and I know Ariane and Jill are going to talk about implementing some of these framework ideas. We've got something called secure stairs. It's quite simple. Secure means look after, use trauma-informed care, look after people right, smile, understand the impact of trauma, absolutely care for your staff, which means supervision structures, which means a recognition of the trauma and the impact that people working in these services are faced with day in, day out, and recognize that frontline staff, prison officers, residential care staff, yacht officers at the front line, foster carers, support workers in an inpatient unit, they are the primary facilitators of change, not psychologists, psychiatrists, and other people. We support and empower that process, if we can. And it's not moving on. The next bit is multidisciplinary, multifactorial formulation, not categorical. What that means is all theories and all perspectives have value, including the young person's, and we bring them all together and we tolerate the disagreement. Then we create a story. If you want to know more about that, we've got something later on. But I'm going to hand over to, because it's not, it's working now. I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to hand over to Ariane.
It's an absolutely massive room, so I'll do my best. I'm going to use my notes to stay on point. I'm Ariane Hammond. I'm a forensic psychologist for HMPPS Youth Custody Service. I was initially involved in the development of enhanced services, but since that time there's been a massive range of colleagues that have been involved. So I feel a bit of a fraud standing up here and talking about it on my own. But colleagues from MODGE, YCS, HMPPS, NHS, and I think it's taken that coordinated multidisciplinary effort to make something like this get off the ground. So if you can take one message away from all of our presentations, I think it's really important for all these agencies to work together. I'm sure you talked about it yesterday, but obviously the custodial population's changed quite a lot in recent years, become a lot more complex. And as a result, in 2014, we developed a psychologically informed approach to managing young people's behaviour in custody, which was informed by a range of evidence, including a suite of prisms, review of literature. And along the bottom axis here, you've got the frequency of needs, the number of young people, and along the vertical axis is the intensity of that need, so the complexity of those needs. All the way up to interventions represents the main custodial population. Those young people exist within the main regime and need various levels of psychologically informed care depending on their needs. Some young people will require some periods of separation for either their own protection or the protection of others, but and generally the aim of that separation is to reintegrate those young people into the main population. And that's where these specialist services get involved. What we're going to be talking about is the tip of that triangle, those young people with exceptionally complex needs that are often separated from the main population, and the goal isn't necessarily to reintegrate them because that main population isn't going to be sufficient enough to meet that wide range of complex needs. And Secure Stairs, which Andy was talking about, is an example of that, where you have specialist coordinated services coming together to meet those exceptionally complex needs. So it's about improving those coordinated services between the systems to enable us to provide an in-reach service to the young people within an enhanced support unit and an outreach service to the rest of the young people in the main population to prevent any deterioration in need. Is that making sense so far? Okay. So in terms of the enhanced support unit purpose and development, so it was designed, like I said, for those who can't reintegrate into the main regime. It's all about the coordinated specialist services and having a multi-agency team of representatives. So the whole strategy relies on there being specialist coordinated services from different disciplines of psychology to psychiatry, education, residential staff, casework, all integral to making that work. It's part of the YCS's Youth Custody Reform Project, and we opened our first ESU in Feltham on the 6th of November, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And we're currently looking at scoping opportunities at Wetherby and Cookenwood and Warrington, be those enhanced support units, depending on accommodation approval, or enhanced support teams who can still support all those young people with those needs. And as with everything psychologically informed, we're really keen to evaluate the effectiveness of this approach. So here are the eligibility criteria for an ESU. So you'll see some of those causal factors that Hugh and Andy have been talking about, so brain injuries, developmental disorders, and also you've got the behaviours that are exhibited, so those that are causing a real risk to self or to others, and they need that intensive level of support. So I'm sure all of you have worked in an environment, those young people that are so complex, they're sort of draining resources left, right and centre, which leaves the other young people with a bit less care, and it's so difficult to meet their needs. So the really important part of this eligibility criteria is that it's for those young people where the existing systems, the main population, isn't working. Some young people with exceptionally complex needs might have their needs met through the enhanced support team providing outreach, which is fantastic. The existing systems can work for them, but this is reserved for those with such exceptionally complex needs. So here's an example of who might be in the enhanced support team. So this is Feltham's enhanced support team. So it has input from primary and secondary healthcare, including CAMS, so that CAMS has clinical psychology and psychiatry. The prison service psychologists within there are forensic and counselling. Education staff, a range of custodial staff from officers, physical education instructors and conflict resolution practitioners, and also casework. And that enhanced support team, like I said, is providing in-reach into the unit and outreach to the young people still within the main population who have complex needs emerging. So the kind of outreach that might be provided is perhaps if someone was in the separation unit, the enhanced support team might do some assessment, and a risk assessment on them, risk and needs assessment, and look at whether they can reintegrate into the population or the clinical decision is actually their needs might escalate to enhanced support unit, and also provide interventions to those really complex cases. So the enhanced support unit is part of the prison service accommodation, so it operates in accordance with all the relevant national and local instructions that exist within a custodial environment. But it's a distinct unit and it's got a distinct purpose. So we've developed 19 additional delivery principles with which an enhanced support unit needs to run by. And that provides a bit of a framework to ensure that there's effective practice. And importantly, there's so much goodwill and passion in the youth estate. And with all these different agencies coming together, sometimes the direction of travel can get a bit lost. So this provides a framework to prevent drift and maintain the integrity of the purpose of the enhanced support unit. So that's the aim, is to increase the cost and impact effectiveness of it. These principles are really, really key. So those of you who are keen bakers amongst us, or you, I'm not, but I'll pretend I will for the sake of this sort of analogy. If any of you have ever baked your favourite cake and missed out a key ingredient, you'll probably have found it hasn't cooked, or you haven't been able to eat it, or it's next to useless or tastes disgusting. In the enhanced support unit, you need all those principles to come together. An enhanced support unit is just as scientific a principle as a cake, and these principles put those into operation. So I haven't got very long. How long? 3 minutes. Okay, right, I'll be really quick. There's 19 of them, so I'll just give you the headlines. 4. Yeah, good, bargaining there, I like it. Right. So number 1 and number 2, about having management teams. This is so important for any strategy, particularly one that relies on multidisciplinary working, that there's a central structure and a local structure that is driving forward these principles within the environment. And for example, Feltham's ESU can link into the YCS critical case panel, which is looking at those most complex cases across the whole of YCS. And as Geeta was talking about earlier, some of those synergies and rubs that exist within multidisciplinary working can be ironed out within those central and local management structures. The physical environment's really important. I'm sure you're all massively aware of that, but having one that promotes healthy development. So, for example, at Feltham, they've built a schnoozalum room, a multisensory room, and the whole environment's been designed in accordance with autism principles for an Autism Society accreditation. The enhanced support team, I've talked about that being really multidisciplinary. The referral and assessment's really important, that we get the right people on there. At Feltham, for example, a number of young people were referred, and of those, ones that met the criteria were selected for the unit. Of those that weren't selected, advice and guidance was then given back to the staff in the main population about how to work with those needs within that environment. Placements, vital. So at the moment, obviously, Feltham is the one ESU, but the plan is to have enhanced support unit or enhanced team provision across all the sites, that young people can be located as close to home as possible to enable resettlement. The case formulation and treatment, Andy's spoken quite a lot about that, but it's really about making sure that instead of just providing a diagnosis, we're providing a plan by which we can treat the young people and the sequence in which to do that, to avoid that piecemeal approach Andy was talking about. So which intervention by which professional needs to come first. Education is quite self-explanatory. So it's really important young people have an opportunity to develop positive, trusting relationships in custody. And us sort of specialists, we can do that, but we tend to drift in and out a bit of their care. So a really important element to the ESU is having this stable and equipped staffing team that can forge positive relationships with the young people. So, for example, we have the CUSP, the Custody Support Plan Initiative, which I definitely don't have time to talk about. Number 11 is about having an appropriate and supportive regime. So at Feltham, they're developing a rewards-based approach rather than a sanction-based approach, and that's inspired by some work at Medway STC, looking at a points-based approach to reward. 12 and 13, that's quite self-explanatory. 14, conflict resolution. So in all social situations, conflict exists. Actually, it exists within the staffing as much as the young people. And as Andy said, these environments are pretty traumatic just by the nature of the people we're caring for. So it's important that there's an approach that supports resolving conflict. And at Feltham, they've trained a number of their staff in specific skills to resolve conflict using an evidence-based restorative justice model. We've also done a training needs analysis and provided psychologically informed training to the staff and the managers to make sure they've got the relevant skills. Alongside that, a staff supervision model to enable their continued professional development, but also to protect their psychological well-being given the challenging nature of this task. Number 18, inclusion. Black and Asian minority ethnic young people are really disproportionately represented across the YCS. So it's really important that the central and local management teams ensure that no discrimination is occurring and that all services are accessible by all young people. And lastly, evaluation, quality assurance. So we need to find a way to make sure that we're adhering to quality standards that are effective. Obviously, these principles are evidence-based, but we're looking at different ways of internal and external scrutiny. For example, I don't know if any of you are aware of the Royal College of Psychiatry Enabling Environment Award. Feltham ESU have signed up to that. I'll leave you with the cake. Thank you.
Good morning, bore da bawb. It's lovely to be here today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Jill Adams. I'll be talking about practice. I can't go into the detail, and my learned colleagues can talk about the brain and psychology, etc. But I'm here to talk about real practice that happens in real time with real young people in our offices every day of the week. So it's great to be able to come here to speak to you today. Just to say quickly that the enhanced case management model is a model that was supported through collaboration with YJB Wales, Welsh Government and the All Wales Forensic Consultation and Treatment Service. And in collaborating, that's been able to drive through some really important work that Carmarthenshire were involved in, going on for about 3 years ago now, alongside 2 other yachts. Cordis Bright have produced an evaluation report, if you want to read more, and that was produced in March of this year. Just to say as well, I've been in youth justice since 1991, and I've seen a lot of changes in that time, and I can say in all honesty that this model and the way we worked has been really welcomed by managers, staff, and by senior managers. There was talk about embedding practice, and I think that this model has really been well embedded in Carmarthenshire Yacht. We had 12 young people that went through the test, and you'll be able to read more about that, as I said, in the evaluation by Cordis Bright. Excuse me. In terms of context then, there was a sort of shrinking cohort. There was less young people coming through the system, sort of influenced partially by changes in legislation and different ways of working with people. And between December 2008 and 2013, there was a reduction in the number of young people that went into custody. However, what we did know that those young people left within statutory order and in custody, as has been spoken about earlier, were the most complex cases and the ones that were really asking us to beg questions of ourselves in terms of how we could implement work practices to try and change, which was quite embedded in entrenched behaviour. And so I think, we'll all agree that it was time to find a new way of working really with this smaller group of young people, sometimes referred to as the thickening of the soup. Well, what we do know, my colleagues have explained this far better than ever I could, but we know that early neglect and trauma leave a lasting impression on the brain, and how we are treated changes our brains, and that will set up how we behave as well. And I don't know if any of you have seen this in the press recently. I saw it recently in the press, but there was a piece of work done by Public Health Wales as well on adverse childhood experiences, and within that study there was commentary around the impact of extreme neglect and adversity on the brain, and the impact of adverse childhood experiences on a young person's health outcomes long term. So, trauma recovery model, and I'll take you through that a little bit. So it's a framework for practitioners to guide young people through change, and it was developed by Dr. Tricia Skews and Johnny Matthew. It was initially developed in Hillside Secure Children's Home, which is in Neath in Wales. I spoke to Johnny Matthews before I came because I wanted him to have some input into what is said today. And in the second point there, he gives an overview of what the model sets out to achieve. So it gives work as a measure against which to assess the child. It then goes on to suggest what might be driving the issues and how best to address them. So having a robust theory which takes into account the trauma and development to help guide assessment, intervention and planning and review is helpful and necessary to do a good job and get consistency across staff teams in wide geographical areas. And so that's the underpinning model. And then the theory is that young people must move through a number of stages in order to achieve a good outcome. And the stages are here. So the first stage is about getting some structure out of a situation of chaos. We have all worked with young people who, when we first meet them, they've got high levels of complexities, they haven't been to school for a long time, they may have health problems, family problems. We are just another agency on the long, long list of people they need to see, people who've tried to assess them, etc. And so the first and most important bit is to get the young person used to structure, boundaries and a routine. And once that has been achieved, then you go on to build a positive and trusting relationship. And that's based on all the pro-social modelling, issues like reliability, maintaining trust, and doing this as a practitioner whilst dealing with some of the anger that you may face. I mean, one of the young people I can think about, it was very, very difficult to keep her in the room. She'd start off the session by shouting and by being very angry about being on the order. And we got her into such a situation that she felt that the model had really helped her to address some of the deep-seated issues that she was experiencing. So the third stage is talking together about difficult issues, and at this point therapeutic input from practitioners and other specialists can be introduced. This leads to the young person reaching self-awareness and realise the harm they've done to others. So the trust allows them to be able to start to actually unpick their own behaviour. And then you get into a situation where self-awareness is the platform for the young person to plan to change and eventually move on. And so those are the identified stages. I'm not going to go through this, but if you do some research into this model, you'll see this triangle. It's based on Maslow, loosely. One of my favourite bits about this is that the foundational belief is redeemability, and that's why we're all in the room, really, isn't it? You know, we all believe that, you know, the power in young people being able to change, and I think that drives through our practice. And the trauma recovery model, I think, is one part of that jigsaw, really. It's not a panacea for all ills, but it actually does give practitioners a very good, robust model to work off. So taking the trauma recovery model a little bit further, what we did in Carmarthenshire as part of the test was delivered an enhanced case management model, and that model is taking trauma recovery and having expertise from psychology and the project leaders to assist practitioners on the way. So enhanced case management builds on assessment, and it gives a focus on the developmental causes which are giving rise to current problems. It's a complex clinical process, and for me to describe it, basically, I've been involved in it when I was an operation manager. You go along with your case manager, you go along with the file, okay? Go along with the file, and you also can invite other practitioners, social workers, etc., into that formulation, and you work through a life map, basically. You do genograms. And then from that first formulation meeting, the practitioner will invariably go back and speak to the family, speak to the young person about some of these significant events in their lives, drilling down, finding out more. Interventions then are based on case formulations, and they have led to current behaviours and difficulties. So you can move on to explore those. And the approach is extremely effective in helping children to recover lost ground, which goes back to what some of my colleagues were speaking about earlier. So unpicking it a bit further, it's really, really important that staff get a thorough grounding in the model and in enhanced case management. So that means a commitment to training in the knowledge and skills underpinning the model. The role of the clinical psychologist is absolutely critical, and staff have been very praiseworthy and have valued that input because it's helped them to guide their practice with young people. And secondly, it has also allowed supervision of the practitioner as well by the clinical psychologist to help guide how they're feeling about working with the young people themselves. So it's a very valuable element. And I think this is my last but one slide. So, you know, the model promotes a person-centred approach. I mean, this is really critical in terms of UNCRC, the voice of the child in Wales, you know, children rights in Wales underpin all key legislation. So it's a refocus on the child and what they want, what they like doing. Families and significant others can be included in the process as well, which is really, really important because you're getting a young person to change. Well, maybe the family might need to make some changes as well. And it offers a robust methodology for working with the harder to reach young people. It's the doing with not doing to approach. And staff have said it feels like a bit like a breath of fresh air, really. They have felt very supported through case formulation and through the psychological input. And they feel empowered and energised and confident to work in different ways with the more complex young people. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much. Every time I hear about the trauma-informed approach, I learn something new. And I think that just goes to show how much development is happening in this space. Chair's prerogative, I'm going to take 5 minutes off your tea break, if that's okay. But I wondered if anyone had any questions for the panel. And whilst we just get a few hands up, I probably will only have time for 2 questions. I wonder if the panel could just maybe reflect on what we've heard this morning and give us one piece of advice, the sort of advice that us as practitioners in YOSs or in the prison services, what would that bit of advice be about how we get to a trauma-informed service or approach that's more consistent, perhaps, please? Don't know who wants to start. I'll start the end.
As the chair of the group that looks at secure stairs.
The number one would be to value people at the rock face. That is absolutely number one. My experience of working with foster carers, as I say, in any residential establishments, the people who look after young people, the people who are the effectors of change are the ones with the closest relationship. And actually we need to be better at looking after and supporting those first, because unless we can help them manage the anxiety and the experiences and help them with structure and hold them, then they're not able to think through all the things that they need to do. So actually less focus on the children and more focus actually on how we support staff, be they prison officers or whatever, first. And then, because actually supported like that, they know what to do, which is build really good relationships with children and young people, listen to them, hear their story. Once you get the story, what helps, they can sort of tell you. So that would be my number one, rather than they've got a problem, let's prescribe a solution. Actually pull it back a bit and let's think about much more about the system.
Great,
I don't know whether other people would think the same.
Who wants to go next? Ariane?
Yeah, I think, is that on? I think in these sorts of environments, the challenge that the cohort we're looking after is huge. And so things will go wrong or feel like they're starting to go wrong. And so I think having a framework within which to operate is really important. So that can be, we can fall back on that. So for example, those delivery principles are so central to the effective running of the ESU, because without those, there's no parameters with which everyone's operating by, and it depersonalises a lot of the need for different services. So some of the wranglings that have historically existed between different organisations is sort of eroded by the fact that these are our shared principles that we operate by, and that shared approach is so important.
Great, thank you. Jill?
Well, I think that in terms of the enhanced case management model, it is about staff at the rock face. And I think if you can give staff the skills and the knowledge and the clinical support, as well as your normal line management support, that will really drive the practice through. And it does make a difference to practice then. And young people notice that difference. There's no doubt about it. They know they're being asked. Staff have got the confidence to ask the young person to lead, you know, and to be able to manage the order in a more creative way, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Before I come to you, Hugh, just got a last comment over there.
The more I've done this and the more I've talked to colleagues and observed some of these ideas across a range of organisations, the more I've come to realise the importance of leadership and aligned leaders. If you're parents in a system, we all know that. If your parents are arguing, then your system, you're not setting a culture. So there are going to be arguments, there are going to be disagreements, because actually the system and the organisations set us up in those ways. But for leaders to truly come together, set a vision and to hold together rather than in times of crisis, actually we all start disagreeing with each other, is an absolutely central pillar, I think.
Great, thank you. Hugh?
Yeah, so just listening to that as well, because I was thinking about healthcare. I worked mostly in neuro-rehab in post-acute settings in stroke and brain injury. And the way teams work in healthcare is quite interesting, because there's that sharing of responsibility, and because that's empowered by typically by the management system, typically in healthcare systems. And people working in social care have struggled to feel supported, I think, over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And so I think it's that with more healthcare linking up more effectively with social justice and care networks, I think that might help to look again at how do we maybe manage those systems more effectively and share responsibility, and also socially, because I was talking about what we need to do with schools, what do we need to do across the whole system, because the criminal justice system is picking up the problems that we've caused ourselves through our society in some ways. So I think there's an issue there about the systems, how systems work, and what we can learn from as we integrate more, hopefully. And you mentioned parenting. I mean, that in so many ways, it's a bit like what does a parent do? In a way, you're a bit of a life coach to your kid, aren't you? Anybody, kind of, you're trying to do and encourage them to think ahead and plan, problem solve, and not to judge them too harshly when they sometimes not judge them at all, but to try to be empathic, and that's what you're role modeling. So it's the importance of enabling people who are at the front line to feel bold enough and enabled to be able to work alongside people who are vulnerable and at risk in a way that helps them to get a model of how to cope and deal and all the rest of it. And I think that role modeling goes across the whole system.
Great, thank you all very much. I don't think we've got a roving mic, so hold your questions and please do ask the panel when you see them either in the workshop or later on. And I'm also very aware there are a number of people in the audience who have had trauma-informed training and are using it in their YOSs currently in London and other places. So please do find those individuals and talk to them about how does it feel to work in a YOS, have the trauma-informed approach. How does it change our systems around policies, practice, our workforce development, and really the whole system of the Youth Offending Service needs to sort of align with it, not just individual parts of it. So I'm now going to thank the panel, if that's okay, please, and we can move on. So you now have time for tea break, and if you can please go to your workshops for 11:15, and each workshop will have a room that's labelled outside. Thank you very much.